Okay, I will stop share and then you can share yours as part of the introduction.
Okay. If we are going to keep on schedule, we will now introduce Glenn Tremper. How many years ago was it, Glenn, that we met down in, of all places, Disneyland?
I actually think you and I met 12 years ago or so. We then met in Disneyland a little bit later.
Is that right? Okay.
Yeah.
I've had the privilege of working with Glenn up in Montana on quite a few cases, and Glenn is a class act attorney. Enjoy working with him. He has been very effective in what he has done, and it's been a privilege to work with you, Glenn. Let you share your screen and take over, and you can tell us a little bit about yourself and
All right.
And what you propose.
Thank you. I hope everybody can see the screen here. Yeah, I've had the privilege of working with Eugene, like I said, for about 12 years. Just really have found him to be not only an excellent expert, but also a friend and a mentor in a lot of things. I found the presentations this morning that we enjoyed to be really helpful because I think they weave within what I want to talk about today. You know, the first question I think a lot of people have is, well, who is this guy and why should I listen to him? And so I want to, if you can indulge me a little bit, I can talk a little bit about who I am and what my experience is here. And then I'm going to have a chance to get to know you guys a little bit better too. But as Eugene mentioned, I'm a lawyer practicing in Great Falls, Montana. We share a lot with Salt Lake City. We also had a significant windstorm here recently. We've already had our first snow in the winter. We are in the midst of COVID, not as serious or as substantial in its impact, at least in a direct way. But in an indirect way, we are seeing a lot of what was discussed in the previous panel, and that is there's been a significant impact on residential, residential demand. We're seeing a huge influx of folks from the coast realizing that they can work from Montana and they can continue to hold their jobs in the Bay Area or Seattle or Tacoma or Manhattan and live in Montana. And so it's had a significant impact on the price of our residential property and our recreational property. Being from Montana and having seen this boom and bust cycle happen in the past, I will reserve judgment on it for about 3 winters, and we'll see just how permanent of a change this is. I've been practicing for 33 years as a lawyer. I'll stop there for a moment and mention that when I presented at another conference, somebody said you can't have practiced 33 years, and I thought at first they thought it was because I was just saying stuff that sounded ignorant and unexperienced. But what it came down to was the color of my hair. Over my shoulder here, you can't quite see it, is a picture of my 94-year-old father before he passed away last year, and he had about the same tint of hair. So gray hair, as lawyers on the panel will know, is the color of money, and unfortunately, it's something I have not had the pleasure of experiencing. I also noticed that Zoom has this feature where it can change your complexion and it can take a few wrinkles away. So I have been practicing 33 years, began in San Francisco. I graduated in 1987 from the University of Montana Law School. I'm a 4th generation Montanan. I had the privilege of clerking for the Chief Judge of the Ninth Circuit for a couple of years. I had met my wife in San Francisco, and then I practiced for about 4 years as we got married and started a family. My wife will tell you that you can take the boy out of Montana, but you can't take Montana out of the boy. And I understood how to raise a child in Montana a whole lot better than I did living in San Francisco. And so we moved our family back in 1993 and really have never regretted it. What I'm bringing here today is not simply, 33 years of practice representing general contractors and subcontractors, material suppliers, and everybody involved in the industry. But I'm also here as somebody who owns a facility. I have worked with my family who owns a fairly significant commercial property in Western Montana. And we have undertaken 4 fairly significant redevelopment projects. And so this very week, I'm working with contractors and dealing with some of the things we're talking about in terms of scheduling problems with COVID, how do we keep the workers healthy, and all of those things. And I've been an owner's rep on other projects as well. So I'm coming here not just as a lawyer and a person who's done some construction litigation in the past, but I'm coming here as somebody who is also facilities owner. So I found some of the discussion this morning very helpful. I want to get a sense of who I'm talking to. I see on our presentation, at least before I got on board here, that there are about 24 people who are on have signed up. Some have their video turned off, and I certainly respect that. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop the share here. And now I'm looking at the gallery view. And if you know Zoom, you know that you can turn on your video and we can simply raise hands and I can ask you questions, and that would be really helpful. But if you also go down to the bottom of the screen and you click on participants, you'll see that there's an option to raise your hand. And if that's the way you would like to do this, I'm perfectly happy to accept that. So if we could just get a little sense of who we're talking to here so I can adjust my comments accordingly. Let me just start by how many folks here are practicing lawyers? I'm seeing some hands here and there. Okay. How many folks are going to be who are contractors, general contractors, otherwise are involved in the industry, but maybe not as lawyers? I'm not seeing a whole lot. I'm assuming that most of the folks that we're talking to here have some legal, experience, at least maybe some experience with mediation. And so I'm going to tone my discussions accordingly. If anyone's got a question, wants me to clarify something, just feel free to jump in, raise your hand, and we'll try to answer some questions. We can use the chat as well.
Glenn, a majority of these people that are attending currently are here for the CLE credits and are practicing and practitioners of the law.
Excellent. Okay, good. Okay. What I have discovered over the years is in my own practice, I found that mediation as a representing parties and certainly as a mediator has become a lot more effective and successful just by simply reflecting on what it is that we experience when we as humans are involved in conflict. Conflict is something that is uncomfortable to a lot of different people. It causes a lot of reactions, and understanding just even a little bit about that has certainly been helpful in my process of getting cases resolved, both as a lawyer for the parties and as a mediator. And some of these principles also apply in the disputes that have not yet resulted in litigation or are not in a formal mediation process. And so what I would like to do is just kind of review a little bit about some of the concepts of what it means to be a human in conflict. But we're also going to reflect a little bit about what mediation and what works in mediation and go from there. I'm going to skip a couple of slides here because I've already covered them. I mentioned who I am. One thing that I didn't mention is that after the 33 years of practice, I am now making the decision to no longer take litigated matters and work exclusively as a neutral. The bar here in Montana is fairly small. The total bar of active lawyers is somewhere around 2,500 lawyers. The construction bar is probably about 24. And so if you're going to do mediation in Montana in the construction field, you need to kind of get out of it because I spent my time on both sides, both defense and plaintiffs more recently, and I've made the decision to get out of the litigation so that I can be truly a neutral. And so effective that last November, I've changed my practice to Tremper dispute resolution. I've mentioned that I practiced for 33 years. It's been a complex commercial litigation practice. I've represented general contractors, subcontractors, suppliers, insurers, lenders, and then in the past 12 years or so, owners and owners associations. I've handled contract claims, design negligence claims, and homeowner claims. And I've mentioned that I do work with commercial and institutional projects as an owner's rep as well. Everyone wants to have a few family pictures, and so I wanted to just share a few things that I've encountered over the years. Montana is like a lot of the eastern front of the Rocky Mountains, plagued by expansive soils. And in Great Falls and throughout Montana, we've had a number of really significant foundation problems with expansive soils. Our expansive pressures are just pretty substantial. And the other thing about Montana is that there is no real licensing or training required to build residential houses. The joke is, with no disrespect to general contractors, that in Montana, the only requirements to be a general contractor are a pickup truck, a dog, and beer cans in the back. And so many have encountered the difficult design issues of expansive soils and not succeeded. And so, in many circumstances, we've dealt with plaintiffs who have had their dreams cracked because of this expansive soil. We also have issues in Montana related to just minor ice damming. This is an ice dam up in the Yellowstone Club of a condominium complex that I help the owners associations deal with the defects of insulation and roof design. We had the pleasure of having destructive testing in that case. There were 17 parties, which meant that we had lawyers and consultants up on these roofs for about a week doing this sort of thing, probing to see how these roofs were built. And then this is my family's commercial property, which is in the stage of being redeveloped. We are encountering the issues of, we started this before COVID. We had the whole question of, can we continue construction as an essential service? If so, how does it work? How do the contractors need to socially distance? I should add that in Montana, one of our big spreading events is a hotel down near the Yellowstone Club. As of a month ago, they had tracked something like 100 cases to this one particular project. And I think we all know how contractors can be picking up shared tools, and who knows what happens after the day is done. They can acquire COVID. And so Gallatin County is really one of our larger counties in terms of COVID exposure. And so we had to deal with all that in our family redevelopment. Again, my proposition here today is that we all can improve the outcomes of mediation if we simply have a basic understanding of this thing that we call conflict. And what I was struck with, and we'll get to a little bit more in hearing Mike's discussion this morning, was just the way that we have adapted to just the human elements, the human factors when it comes to making accommodations for disabilities. We understand that there are things that we need to be aware of when we design and build a building to make people be able to overcome tendencies or limitations that they have when it comes to physical, or other handicaps. And that's kind of the concept here that I think we're trying to do is, what is it that tends to be triggered when we are in conflict that can create problems, and how do we overcome it? And so what I'm going to do is just simply, I'm going to ask you to sit back, think about some of these things. If you're like me, it would be like dropping pebbles into a pond and see ripples. But I'm wondering if after some period of time, if you sort of start thinking about these things, you might find that you're resolving conflict a little more effectively. I want to talk about a couple of matters here. The first thing is that conflict is not a negative term. The Latin terms, the Latin derivative or roots of the word are from essentially meaning to strike together. And you can have things that strike together productively or unproductively. You can have a sword and a shield striking together in war, but you can also have two rocks hitting each other, creating a sharper edge, and that certainly was useful for some of our prehistoric relatives. There's a proverb that some people may be familiar with, that as iron sharpens iron, so one person sharpens another. There's lots of examples, I think of using conflict creatively. And I think if we're in the practice, litigation practice, for example, we probably know that there are times when we're darn proud of our use of conflict to acquire or to achieve some sort of good result for our client. And so I'm not trying to say that conflict is a negative. We don't always respond well to conflict. I've seen studies of lawyers, and lawyers are some of the most conflict avoidant people. Somebody said that we are about the same level of conflict avoidance as like sociopaths. We just don't want to really have any interaction. I think a lot of that is simply our exposure to just the difficulties and the emotional challenges sometimes, and so we'd rather not bring that onto ourselves. I think everybody knows what mediation is. It's a use of a neutral third party to assist in the process of conflict. It's different from arbitration, where arbitration is you let a third person make a decision for you. Mediation, therefore, necessarily requires parties to interact with each other, engage with each other, and deal with conflict. And so that's why I view conflict as an important part of the mediation process. There's a couple of questions that some people might ask when they hear where I'm going with this. The first is, why are we talking about mediation in the middle of a pandemic? You know, a lot of us understand mediation is, you know, parties fly in from all over the country. You get them in a room. The mediator meets with them in a variety of different rooms over a day or two, and they all work out their differences, and they try to they achieve some sort of compromise. You can't do that now. You can't get together in one room. When the mediation, when the COVID lockdown hit, you know, there were mediations scheduled throughout our state, and you know, that weekend all the mediators got online to figure out this thing called Zoom and understand how to do it. Many of them canceled, and they've yet to be rescheduled. But the point is, I think it is appropriate to talk about mediation in the middle of the pandemic because, like everything, mediation is changing. It's no longer, you know, necessarily an in-person process. Our panel earlier, there was a discussion about how mediations have been taking place through Zoom, and it can be effective, and in some ways more effective. If you're not aware, Zoom has the ability to set up confidential, secure meeting rooms, just like you'd have separate meeting rooms, you know, in a hotel or a law firm where you're holding a mediation. It also has the ability to prevent, you know, unauthorized persons from accessing the mediation. There are screen sharing options and other options that make it, you know, fairly useful process for really trying to talk about a conflict. The other thing is I think people are realizing, and it's true of a lot of things, that you don't necessarily have to engage in travel to effectively deal with whatever you need to deal with. As a mediator in Montana, I may be needing to mediate in Billings one day and in Kalispell the next. Well, there's just 6 hours of difference of travel time between the two, 6.5. And so I think I'm welcoming this possibility of mediating remotely. I'm also hoping that, you know, I can be mediating in the construction fields throughout the region, you know, in Utah, in Colorado, in Arizona. And if that's the case, there's not necessarily a need for the parties to pay for travel when mediation can be done remotely. I do think it's going to really open up, you know, the availability of good mediators in a lot of different places. One thing about mediation, I don't know what people's experience has been, is that Zoom is something where, you know, we can be on Zoom for a whole day, but it is hard to engage for a whole day. There's this thing called Zoom fatigue, and a lot of people experience it when you're talking. You know, I experience it with regular meetings, and I think people can experience it when they're talking about mediation. There is no reason why mediation can't be broken down into bite-sized bits, where a mediator can say, okay, I'm going to visit with the plaintiff for these 2 hours and give the parties a break, and then I'm going to visit with these parties for another hour and these parties for the hour after that. You can break it up. You can even schedule that out over separate days. And because we don't necessarily have to worry about the parties traveling to the mediation, you can have some flexibility in scheduling there. So that's something I think a lot of mediators understand may be helpful. There's always that the value of a mediation coming to about the 4:30 hour, and you need to wrap it up because everyone's got to get on the plane and go back. And most mediators will know that is something very valuable and effective. But there, you know, and that certainly isn't something you get if you're scheduling separate sessions with the parties. But there is a trade-off, and in some cases it is beneficial. You can, as a mediator, as a party, still impose those sorts of hard stop deadlines to get the parties to really start making a decision. The next question I think a lot of us ask, at least I kind of asked as I was thinking about this talk, is, do I really want to talk about conflict now? Because, face it, we're in some really interesting times. Not only pandemics, but, we're in the crazy season of a political season. We've got fires, we've got windstorms, we've got, just a number of crazy things going on here, where conflict seems to be the only thing you see on the news. And so do we really think that we can constructively reflect on and deal with conflict? Well, I think the answer is yes. I think we can reflect on what conflict theory tells us about what we might be going through. One thing I've noticed is in terms of trying to do mediation and trying to get people to participate in real authentic discussions about the disputes they may have, is that we're all really cranky, and our tempers are short, and our patience can be a little bit less than it used to be. And so maybe understanding that and accommodating it might be an appropriate thing to do. So if you're willing to talk about conflict, I am too. In the construction field, my observations in my involvement with the field are that, I really think that most contractors and most parties in the field actually handle conflict pretty darn well. I mentioned that I'm working with the project, and I attend construction meetings, twice or every 2 weeks, and I sometimes sit and marvel at the general contractor's representative and his ability to effectively deal with differing opinions. But if you're a contractor, you have to deal with employees. If you're a general contractor, you're going to have the conflicts with the subcontractors, and those conflicts are numerous. General contractors and subcontractors can have their conflicts with suppliers, designers, and regulatory agencies. Some of the types of conflict you can see in the construction field are, timing conflicts. When do you start? When do you end? Did you delay me? Did you interfere with me? Is there a basis to terminate your performance? Should liquidated damages be assessed? Should a performance bonus be paid? What should be built can be a source of conflict. What do the plans say? How does the RFI process work? How do you deal with design errors? How do you deal with somebody failing to follow the plans? We have change directives. We have the ubiquitous change orders. How do you deal with the unexpected? How do you deal with the site conditions being different than what it was designed for? And of course, there's a force majeure clause, and some of that was discussed in the prior panel. Not only just the usual force majeure, but what do you do about supply chain issues and pandemics that might shut down the ability to proceed? I'll pause there and just mention there's one other issue that we're seeing in terms of the COVID impact on a project, and that is the regulatory authorities. When we first started this, we put in building, we had tenants who were doing tenant improvements, and they put in their application for a building permit, and it just went into the building department and sat there because everybody was working at home. And it took them a while to get to the point where they had it all digitalized and they were able to work from home. But it added a full month or so to the process of approval of plans. Now the plans are approved and project is underway. They're making decisions about how the project is to be inspected. And so we no longer can have the electrical come out and then the plumbing come out and then the others come out. They all have to come out at once, stand in a socially distant way, and inspect the same thing. Well, that interferes in the ability for us to proceed sometimes. And so that's unexpected, and that's certainly a source of conflict, and we've worked through that. There is the whole question of, is the work proper? Was it complete? Was it defective? Are there warranty issues? There's the workplace safety issues that people have, OSHA violations, worker injuries. The risk management is a source of conflict, insurance coverage, indemnities. And then there's, of course, there's a whole area of conflict of how do you determine what is a fair compensation or damages for some of these claims. And so the point is that, as we all know, construction can be an area can involve a lot of different kinds of conflict. So how do people typically address conflict in the construction trades? And I'm really more talking here about, you know, the general contractor that I know of who's driving around in a pickup truck with a beer can and a dog in the back. A lot of times it is common to see them yell and threaten and bully the subcontractor or the supplier or whoever. Then they'll escalate it. They'll send a nasty gram. You know, they like to text a lot, so you'll see a lot of texts that are complaining. But then they'll also email or have their wife email. Sometimes a lot of times they'll just say, you know what, I'm not going to deal with these people anymore. And so you just stop, you finish up this project and you just say, I'm not going to deal with them on other projects. Contractors are loath to hire lawyers, but they sometimes will. The typical way of dealing with the conflict is sort of the eye for the eye concept, or the tit for tat. You know, if I'm not getting paid, or if I decide not to pay you, well, I'm going to find some defect in your performance, so that the two might balance themselves out. And then something that people do, that we all do, and that is simply ignore it. Ignore it until it becomes a problem. And it's a perfectly legitimate approach sometimes to see if it's going to be a problem, because a lot of times, you know, fate steps in and we don't really need to deal with it. There's a spectrum of ways that people deal with conflict in a lot of different arenas, and this relates to many different arenas. You know, there is the whole attitude of avoiding conflict. And I would venture to say that we avoid conflict most of the time, really, and I'll talk a little bit more about this. But we can avoid it until we decide to engage in it. And by engaging in it, I mean authentically deal with what is the problem, what are the different perspectives, how are we going to move on from here? That then leads us to a willingness to negotiate. In order to negotiate, you have to have two parties. And so you have to set up the stage to where both parties are present, are engaged, and willing to try to resolve this. A lot of conflicts get resolved there through some negotiation process, but mediation can be the next step if they get an inability to really engage authentically in a discussion of a conflict. And that's a definition of mediation, simply assisted negotiation. The mediator can help the parties, you know, with formulating their positions, asking, if you make that kind of demand, what do you expect their response will be? How do you think that's going to, you know, elicit what you want to accomplish in this? And so that sometimes it's helpful to have a third party involved. If you can't get it resolved through mediation, usually there's some process of having the issue turned over to a third party through arbitration or through trial. You know, the difference, of course, between mediation, and it's something I'm sure most mediators will raise with the parties, is, you know, up to the end of the mediation, the parties are in charge of how their solution is formulated. They are in the best position to formulate their solution. They know what their business needs are. They know what their reputational needs are, and they're able to make those decisions that can fulfill their interests. But it's almost you know, an abandonment if you turn it over to a third party to make that decision, because you know that both sides are going to be unhappy. I am a strong believer in that there are those cases that need to be decided by an independent fact finder. But when you weigh the cost of doing that in terms of time and expense, I would venture to say that almost every construction case really ought to be resolved through something other than handing it over to a third party. Arbitration can be handled in an efficient way, but I don't know what your experience is, but it does seem like it grows and becomes almost as expensive as a trial. What I want to talk about is, I think lawyers at least, and I know this, from my own practice and certainly as I'm watching other lawyers do it, I really think that you can avoid conflict almost for every single phase of a litigated case. If I'm a lawyer and I'm representing a defendant and I get a complaint, well, rather than call up and ask, well, what's this about? What are the interests of the parties? How are we going to get it resolved? What do? I file a cursory answer and I serve discovery. And that pushes the whole engagement off for a couple of months. And then I decide, well, do I want to really talk about this conflict? Do I want to engage in it? Well, no, I want to maybe take a deposition or two, or I want to, push it down the road a ways. And we really only start engaging in negotiation and in mediation when we run up against some hard stop, something that's going to force us to really step up and take responsibility. And so what I'm going to just suggest is think about, whether it might be better for your clients and frankly for you, if you try to address the source of the conflict early. As Gene mentioned, and as he knows, my practice the last 12 years has been representing homeowners on the plaintiff side. And what I've discovered is, from a just a practice standpoint, I don't know how many plaintiffs lawyers are out there, but if you can handle 10 cases and engage the parties in a real honest discussion about the risks and the damages, and get those 10 cases resolved, you're going to make more money than if you take 1 or 2 cases and engage in avoidance. And so that's why I think, from a practice standpoint, you want to get involved early. You want to hire the experts early. You want to engage the parties in a real honest discussion about what are their various risks. And I think there's a role for mediators in every stage of a litigated case. I know Eugene is going to talk a little bit about a template for mediation, and I'm certainly an advocate of using a mediator at various stages of a construction litigation. Identify what are the areas of conflict, try to negotiate them, and maybe move on to the next one. So what are some ways of negotiating in the construction field? I mentioned simply the first one is the 6-pack, and it's simply a war story that I'm going to indulge myself in telling. And that is, I had a case where I tried a case for about a week. It really should have been tried for only about 3 hours. And it was between my client, who was a steel supplier, and a chemical company who purchased a smokestack from my client. And there was a contention that the mill scale had not been removed prior to the application of a very high-tech kind of paint. And we tried to compromise. We tried to move that forward to have an honest discussion, but we ended up trying the case. And the judge, who was kind of a folksy guy, said 2 things at the end of the day. He said, no construction case should be tried. That in essence, this was just like a family law case where this wasn't about what happened, it was about how mad you are about each other. And that this should have been resolved with a 6-pack exchange between the project superintendents. So I'm going to skip over this because I think I've covered some of this already, and I know I'm getting a little late on time. This slide, I just want to talk a little bit about this concept, and that is, many of us know of mediation as by a term called alternative dispute resolution, or ADR. And I think that most folks now would agree that the full-blown trial of a case is really fairly rare. And so I think there's an argument that if we're talking about what is the standard method of dispute resolution, well, it's mediation. And the alternate method of dispute resolution is some sort of trial. And so that's why I'm dropping the term alternate from what I do. I engage in dispute resolution. Um, we're running a little late, so I'm going to skip over the next part here. Um, but and I know that many people have had experiences with mediations that have not worked well. And I guess the thought I would have is, reflect on why they didn't go well, why they were a waste of time. My practice has always been when I attend a mediation or conduct a mediation and it doesn't resolve, to spend a few moments the day after writing notes about what happened and why maybe I could have done something differently. Many times they aren't going to settle, but sometimes it's a choice was made that really could have been avoided. There's a lot of study, a lot of writing about how you and I handle conflict. We all know that our brains are really a couple of different units. We have a part of our brain which helps us with the really critical decisions that we make when we're trying to decide how to value a case. It's something that we do thoughtfully and we engage in, and we're sort of proud of our ability to work things out. There's another part of our brain that simply is responsible for keeping us alive. And that part of our brain, when it's under threat, will simply take over that rational side of our brain. It will hijack our brain. I think everyone might remember our friend here in the movie The Waterboy. He was just told that an alligator is ornery because of something called the amygdala longata by our professor here. The amygdala is a part of our brain that does react and does hijack our rational thought. I think we want to think a little bit about, I'll turn this off so it's not so distracting. I think we want to think a little bit about how we have reacted, and we may have seen others reacting here as we're living in what we might perceive to be a crisis of COVID. People talk about the COVID fog, not being able to think straight. And I think that's a process of when we're in a state of feeling insecure, we're not going to be able to think straight. Robert McNamara, our Secretary of Defense, talked about the Cuban Missile Crisis, and he has a phrase, the fog of war, and he talked about just how difficult it is to make rational decisions when you're under a sense of stress. A lot of times what happens is that we get onto a concept and we become like this friend here. This guy's name is Diesel. He's a bulldog, and Diesel has got his hands or got his jaws around a box that he really wants to hang on to, but it's blocking his ability to see where the heck he's going. And I don't know about you, but sometimes when I'm in the middle of a conflict, when I'm finding my position in the case exposed, when I need to reevaluate something, I have a really hard time seeing beyond my own chosen blindness. And so I think about Diesel a lot of times when I find myself simply hitting walls and not moving things forward very far. I think everybody knows that this sort of Chinese puzzle where, if you put your fingers in both sides and pull apart, you're trapped. You're not going to be able to really get yourself free. And there's been a lot of times I've been involved in a litigated matter where, I see the other side pulling apart and we're both just stuck. We're not going to be able to really realistically, escape. And so we're just going to have to keep in this trap until somebody tells us how the case gets decided. Of course, if you simply push together a little bit, you relieve the pressure and you're able to escape from it. And so that's my model here, that we can do that. I know we've got a lot to talk about, and I'm going to kind of move through a few things here, but many people may be familiar with the work of a person named Kahneman. And he and his partner Amos Tversky, they actually won the Nobel Prize in economics. They're psychologists, but they did a lot of work studying, how the human brain thinks, how it processes. And what they discovered is that we really are not entirely rational, and that most of our decisions are made on irrational bases. And so that kind of threw up through the whole world of economics into a tailspin, because we all want to think we're rational, but in fact we're not. And Kahneman, in his book, there's a book called Thinking Fast and Slow, and a pretty turgid book. If you want to read it, it's worth reading, but it also is pretty difficult. I think there's some cliff notes out there somewhere. But he talks about how our brains have two systems: system 1 and system 2. System 1 is one that works fast, it's intuitive, it makes our associations fast, it tends to be more automatic, it repeats well-learned responses. System 2 is going to be applying more focus, it takes time, it applies reason, it resists impulses. Now, you might think that system 2 is the better part of this process. And, you know, in a lot of ways it is, but it's got a major flaw. And that is that it's just darn lazy. What the studies have shown is that when we're engaged in system 2 thinking, it demands a significant amount of energy from our mind, from our source of energy within us. And there's many different studies that have established this, that it's very resource intensive to be using system 2 thinking. And so what typically happens is that it will shut down, or system 2 will shut down, and then just allow those more automated processes to take place. Now, this is how some of our decision-making processes can be misled, is because we are thinking that we are rational. System 2, you know, wants to say, yeah, I'm still on the hook here, but it's really system 1 who's making those decisions. And what results are these things called cognitive biases, ways that our automatic brain will make assumptions, and those assumptions can lead us into error. And there are lists of them that are available, but some of the ones that I see happening in conflicts that I'm involved in is, of course, we have the overconfidence bias. We're all convinced that things are going to be better than they are. Everyone's convinced that the judge is going to believe them and not believe the other side. We also seek out confirming facts. We have the confirmation bias, where instead of seeing things as they are, we see things as we want them to be. And we have a tendency to only see what we think should be there. We assume that there's no other facts. We will shut down the process of gathering facts to inform our rational process way too quickly. We allow opinions to be formed on what was last said or what was easily available. And so, you know, and you see this all the time where somebody will, the last person who speaks tends to have the greater say in terms of how a decision gets made. We certainly like what is familiar. We don't like what is different, what we haven't encountered before, what looks different from us. We tend to prefer what is like us. There's a bias of loss aversion. This is where, you know, a party has already invested a lot of money in a case, and it might have the opportunity to get out of the case for a certain amount of money, but it says, well, I want to, I put so much money into this, I want to just roll the dice and see what happens. And then there's the bias that, you know, doubt and ambiguity, which we always feel when we're listening to our system 2 brain. Doesn't feel that good, particularly when we're in a state of crisis. We don't want to have doubts. We don't want to feel ambiguous. And certainty feels a whole lot better. And so we will tend to allow ourselves to take shortcuts because we like the feeling of being certain. So what do you do about this? You know, should we feel bad because we have biases? No, you know, the issue is, you know, that word bias is sort of this weighted issue, a weighted word. But I view this as, you know, we shouldn't view this as bad. It is what it is, you know. You know, it's like having bad breath. You know, it's not very attractive, but a lot of times we can't do a whole lot about it. What we do, though, is we take care of it when we know that it might be an issue. You know, we freshen our breath when we're going to come in proximity with somebody. And so that's what the thought is here with understanding system 1 and system 2 when we enter into conflict. And that is, make sure you know that you might be prone to these sorts of biases, and be careful about it. And what I want to point out here is that, you know, this is not an uncommon thing. And I'm going to skip ahead of here. I was thinking about how we accommodate, you know, the human tendency to make assumptions in the construction industry. And this is one that came to mind. Eugene actually worked on a case where this was an issue. And the building code has a standard for stair treads, that they have to be of uniform size and shape, and the height of the riser has to be uniform. They can't be more than 3/8 of an inch apart. Well, why is that? Well, it's because our system 1 brain learns how to go up and down stairs, and it's not thinking. You know, our system 2 brain is not locked in where we're thinking, I got to watch what I'm stepping on. And so we can get tripped up if what we expect, what we assume with our system 1 brain is not what reality is. And so we do this in the construction field. Well, I heard you know, Mark's discussion this morning about our the ADA, and that's chock full of this issue. You know, here we have an awareness that we've come to that not everybody can access buildings and use buildings in the same way. They have different abilities, and we as a building trade have determined that we're going to accommodate those tendencies. Well, in a similar way, as we who are conflict professionals, you know, we should be aware of the disabilities, if you will, that our system 1 brain can subject us to as we go through conflict, and we should accommodate them. And so I think that's interesting. Lots of other industries deal with human factors. They understand that we're limited and flawed. I think we as conflict professionals need to undertake the same sort of idea. So how do we apply this to negotiation and to mediation? What I think that there's a number of things we can do here as parties who are involved in conflict and who mediate. I think there's a real value to going slow. You know, the saying that I've heard is that slow in mediation, slow is fast and fast is slow. You have to go at a certain pace. You have to keep things normal. In other words, we've all developed expectations about how a mediation is going to go forward. You're going to start with the plaintiffs, then you're going to go talk to the other side, and you're going to have an exchange. You need to kind of not throw anyone's expectations into upset. You need to kind of make sure everyone knows what to expect. I think there is something about the bartering process, the bidding process, if you will, where one side starts at a number and the other side responds, and you go through this process. I think, you know, psychologically, I suspect that there's something about our brains and the way they evolve that is an absolute critical part of coming to an agreement. And, you know, at mediations, I have people say, well, can't we just skip a few steps? And, you know, sometimes we're tempted to do that, but again, go slow. You know, slow is fast and fast is slow. Sometimes parties need to take those smaller steps so that they get themselves used to making that final commitment. Don't prevent a mental hijack. You know, how many times have you had a case where, you know, you're talking to side and they say, yeah, maybe we should try to see if we can resolve this. Let's hire a mediator, and then you agree on a date, and then they serve a whole bunch of discovery. You know, they're like trying to be strong and forceful, but it really doesn't have the effect that I think you want. Also, during a mediation, sometimes you know, a party will say, I want to send this message, and a good mediator is going to say, wait a second, that's not going to be that's the reaction in the other room is not going to leave them in a position where they can really think about how this case should be resolved. Let people feel comfortable with the feeling of being uncertain, of having ambiguity. That's part of the process. Tell them it's okay, because they're going to feel it. They're going to need to feel it, if they're going to change their position. I think I'm a big advocate of avoiding surprises. I think in a mediation, I'm an advocate of an early convening conference with counsel on the phone where we talk about what is the real issue here, what information needs to be shared, what is your real position here, what are your interests. I do think you should turn off the litigation machine, meaning to step out of that room where that big machine is that's running called the litigation machine that can just be so overwhelming and try to look at things a little bit differently. And then I think what is the definition of a mediation? I don't, or a successful mediation. I don't view a successful mediation as one where, you know, it's successful if the parties have settled, and it's unsuccessful if they haven't. What I tell parties, what I tell my clients when I'm representing them in a mediation is, this will be a success if the case settles, or if it doesn't settle, everybody knows why we're going to trial, why we're going to spend that additional time, why you're going to go through that additional misery to go to trial. And so everybody's had an opportunity to really engage System 2 thinking in deciding whether to settle the case or not. So we've gone on for about an hour here, and I'm going to just stop and ask if there's any questions. I will stop the share screen here so I can see people, and I guess I'll just throw it out for questions and comments. I see somebody has, Chris has helped me with medulla oblongata. Thank you. I'm curious just how many people have seen, you know, an instance where cases that could have gotten settled maybe got not unsettled, or you know, that we weren't successful because somebody engaged in sort of reactive behavior. I'm not seeing a whole lot of comments here. You know, obviously, if you're interested in this, there's plenty of things to talk about. A couple of books that I've read recently that I think are really helpful. There's a book by I can't remember her name, but it's called Thinking in Bets, and it's actually a poker player, world champion poker player, who you know, talks a lot about how decisions are made and how we can how certain biases can really you know, unrail us. And in her circumstance, it's when you're at the poker table. And I think there's a lot of similarities between a poker table and a mediation room sometimes. There's also, we've all heard about the Harvard Negotiation Project, and they wrote the book called Getting to Yes. Back in the 90s, they wrote a book called Difficult Conversations. And it talks a lot about how, you know, we really aren't talking about, you know, any kind of difficult conversation. We need to understand what's really being discussed. And it isn't about what happened. It's about how what happened impacted us. It isn't about who's to blame. It's really about how I see the future going. And so I'd recommend that as well. But, you know, there's a lot of neuroscience out there. There's a lot of great podcasts talking about this sort of thing. And so what I found is, you know, over the years, I've listened to it, I've worked with it, and you know, I don't want to say it's any sort of magical thing, but I've certainly have found that it's my ability to get cases resolved both for parties and as a mediator really have improved. So I commend you for that. So with that, I thank you. And obviously, if anybody has any questions, you can just look me up, shoot me an email.
I have a quick question for you. So I participated in a mediation where the contractor, you know, was adamant that he didn't do anything wrong, and he really didn't, but he was unwilling to acquiesce to anything because he just, you know, said, I didn't do anything wrong, so there's no way I'm doing this. And after some discussion, I mean, the attorney said, you know, well, principles are expensive, you know, and you can, you know, take this all the way to trial and let a judge tell you that you didn't do anything wrong, you know. But I mean, do you have any experiences where that has happened, where how did you get the contractor to finally, say, okay, I'm willing to settle this, and it's,
Right. Yeah. I mean, what's happening there is what the Harvard negotiation project authors call is an identity conversation. We talk about what happened, we talk about damages, we can get all caught up in all of that. But what he's saying is, I think of myself as a better contractor than this, and I want to defend my ability, my reputation. My identity is that I'm not somebody who screws up like this. My identity is somebody who I don't compromise. And so, a lot of times what happens is you just simply need to say, hey, here are ways that we can process this sort of issue. And I understand that you're an excellent contractor and you want people to know that, and that you are a person who, your reputation is very important to you. But, part of the job of being a mediator is sort of the angel of reality. You come in and say, here's what the future will look like. Here's what it could look like if you would agree right now. And maybe you feel a whole lot better about yourself if you agree now than if you let it go on to this process. So it's not an uncommon situation. And I was going to tell a story about, a contractor who we were talking about all this, and he just said, it's black and white. How can you keep saying it's gray? And another slide that I didn't get to is, I don't know if you remember a couple of months ago or a couple of years ago, we had the whole question of the blue dress versus the white and gold dress. And the internet went crazy because there was a slide out there there was a picture out there that some people saw as a blue and white dress and some people saw as a white and gold dress. And they went crazy because people were convinced that somebody was conspiring to make them think that, it actually was something other than what they saw. And the reality is we perceive things differently. We all come from a different set of circumstances. This morning, my wife and I were talking about where we were 20 years ago this morning. And we talked about, here's where, I remember this newscaster talking about this event, at the Twin Towers, or I remember calling you at this time when you were in that meeting. And we had completely different recollections. And what the reality is, we don't want to realize it, but the reality is our ability to our belief about what facts are really influenced by a lot of these neural processes. Now, want to be very careful. I'm not saying that truth is subjective. The dress in controversy was a blue and white dress. We can establish that. What I'm saying is we need to be open to the fact that we may not see things the way they really are. One of my favorite sayings was by William James, who was kind of the father of American psychology. And he says, we don't see things the way they are. We see things the way we are. And so all I'm hoping is that, you would have the opportunity to maybe reflect on that as you go in here to say, be curious, be curious. What is it that you're seeing here that I don't quite get? And listen to what they say. It may not be, this is what happened. It may be, this is how it impacts me. This is how it